admitting people. Welcome. My name is Roger Berkowitz. I'm the founder and academic director here at the Hannah Arendt Center at Bard College. And welcome to the virtual reading group. We are continuing to read Hannah Arendt's The Life of the Mind. This is, as sort of you all know, her last unfinished book. The sections on thinking, which we're in the middle of now, were written and lectured upon often. She gave a number of lectures on these topics. She also taught a course on thinking. And yet it was still needed work, the manuscript, and Mary McCarthy did that. So we're in the middle of so thinking, if the life of the mind is to be divided into three books, thinking, willing, and judging, the first section on thinking is itself divided into 4 chapters or sections. Never know what to call them. The first one is appearance, and that's what we're in right now. Why is the first chapter in a book on thinking titled Appearance? Well, we've talked about that the last few weeks a bit, but it's worth reviewing as we go forward. The world is phenomenal. Phenomenal meaning composed of phenomena, not great. To be alive is to live in a world, namely a world of appearing things. It's a world that precedes us, that's there when we're born into it, and will outlast us. For Arendt, living beings have an urge to self-display, right? This is a little bit of review, but I think it's going to be important. They want to be seen by others. So to be alive, she says, is to appear. Okay, all good. What does that have to do with thinking? Well, thinking is what withdraws from the world of appearances. The thinker lives in their inner self. The thinker never appears in the world. Arendt will, in one of her other essays, make one exception to this in a sense, which is that the thinker appears in the world only when the world is, in a sense, out of joint and becoming totalitarian, and people are so swept up in a movement that the thinker, by standing apart, appears. But thinking itself doesn't appear, right? What does it mean for thinking to appear? Okay, then she says, we do, however, believe that there is something called thinking, or a thinking ego. It is an authentic semblance. So what is an authentic semblance? I'm sorry. Let me remute people. Please keep yourself muted if you're have background noise. There are authentic and inauthentic semblances, right? And it's important for us to make this distinction. An inauthentic semblance is like a dogmatic claim. So an inauthentic semblance would be something like the world was created in 7 days, or an arbitrary assumption, Trump won the election, or a mirage in the desert, right? You see a mirage and you think, oh, there's water there. These are inauthentic semblances because they can be dissolved of their own accord. They can be dispelled, she says, upon closer examination. But authentic semblances are things like, and the example she gives is the movement of the sun that rises in the morning and sets in the evening. Now, you can tell people all you want that that's actually not what happens, that it's not the sun rising and setting, it's the earth moving around the sun. But people are, and they might believe you scientifically, but they will still think that the sun rises in the morning and sets in the evening. These are that this kind of authentic semblance, she says, is inherent in the paradoxical condition of a living being that, though itself part of the world of appearances, is in possession of a faculty, namely the ability to think, that permits the mind to withdraw from the world without ever being able to leave it or transcend it. So this is on page 45, that sentence, but she says this in many places. But the point is that we start with appearances and a chapter on appearances because the world is phenomenal, the world is appearing, and yet thinking is invisible, thinking withdraws. And yet, when we want to think about thinking, we immediately come to this thing called the thinking ego, which we know is a mirage of sort, a semblance. It doesn't, there's not a thing there. There's no actual thing there thinking. And yet, there's this paradoxical condition of which we have the ability to think and we can withdraw from the world and we do think in some way and we know that thinking happens. And yet we also know that that as we withdraw from the world into this world of thinking, this invisible world, we're still part of a phenomenal and apparent world. We're still part of the world of appearances. And so thinking is, in a sense, what bridges this gap between the invisible world, the semblance world of the thinking ego, and the world of appearances. And that's a metaphor, the bridge of the gap, right? You think about a bridge, and as a metaphor, it uses images from the apparent world, namely, in this case, a bridge, to think about thinking, and to bridge the gap of thinking, and this metaphorical aspect, which she'll discuss in the next chapter, is part of is names in many ways the problem of appearance. That on the one hand, thinking is what withdraws and is invisible, and yet it is also that which is part of the apparent world and can only be pictured, and thus pictured with things in the world, thus appearing things. So this is what she's writing about in the first section we read for today, section 5, called Appearance and Semblance. And then also in section 6, the thinking ego and the self. These two sections actually go quite closely together. In section 6, the thinking ego, we're told, is immaterial, not a material thing. It's from the world of intelligibility, the world of thinking, and not a sensible thing. And yet, she's going to argue on page 44 that it is always the same subject that is both a member of the visible and invisible worlds. You can't be a pure thinker, right? And that's going to be the argument against solipsism, which she'll make in that chapter. There is no such thing as a solipsistic individual who is outside of the context of the phenomenal world. So, and when she tries to then articulate what it means, what are the characteristics of this thinking ego, she turns to Kant and other people and talks about the swiftness of thought. Later, she'll talk about how thinking is like the breath of life. Again, metaphors. And the thinking ego here is both real and yet it's a semblance. It's a fallacy and yet it is also meaningful. And so she wants to argue, or she does argue, that this is a critique of positivism, or at least any kind of simplistic positivism. So on page 39, she writes, the natural and inevitable semblances are inherent in a world of appearances from which we can never escape. And that they are, that semblances are inherent in appearance and in a world of appearances is the strongest and certainly the most plausible argument against the simple-minded positivism that believes it has found a firm ground of certainty if it only excludes all mental phenomena from a consideration and holds fast to observable facts. So if you think that the only things that matter are observable facts, empiricism, positivism, you are the proof against that. The best argument against that is the existence of authentic semblances. The fact that there are things in the world that we will never see, like a thinking ego, like justice, and these ideas, these thinking semblances, these authentic semblances, are for her proof positive of an intellectual world. The seventh chapter, if those two chapters, chapters 5 and 6, go together, so too do chapters 7 and 8. And in many ways, well, these are central, important chapters of the whole book, but certainly this is where this first chapter on appearance comes to its conclusion. The basic premise here is that thinking and reality, or reality and the thinking ego, are different. That thinking is not concerned with, in any direct sense, reality. Reality, she defines in the course of this chapter as standing still and remaining the same long enough to become an object of sense. So every object that you can see and that can be seen by others as well, by spectators, is real. And so she will argue a little later in the text on page 50 that the reality of what I perceive is guaranteed by its worldly context, which includes others who perceive it as I do. In other words, the reality of the world is founded in its plurality. It's founded in the fact that other people, I see a bunch of faces on the screen. What makes that real is that you all see a bunch of faces on the screen, and we see it, even though you may see it from a different perspective as me, and there may be a different order. We understand that there's something we share. There's an intersubjectivity that we share. And it's that intersubjectivity, that the same object also appears to others, that convinces me that we all belong to the same species and that we can all think and we can all perceive the real world. At the same time, and this goes, then she discusses this question of solipsism, right? There is no solipsism. There's no pure man as a thinker. We're always embedded in this world. And yet, philosophers have always thought of man as a thinker. Thomas Barcher mentioned this last week when we were on the discussion. Philosophers have always excelled at stepping out of the world of appearances and into the world of ideas, out of the cave and into the sun, to use the Platonic metaphor. They have always excelled at making thought flesh, to bring thought to bear in the world. And yet we know that this thought is something that doesn't exist. as an object. It's not real as an object of sense. You'll never get to it. The ding an sich of the thinking ego is not something you'll ever be able to see. And as this thinking ego, which she says withdraws from the beastliness of the multitude and into the absolute solitude of the one, it doesn't exist, and yet it does. It's not real, and yet it's meaningful. And it's in that meaningfulness, and even that reality, in the sense that we don't see it, and yet we know it, or not know it. That's the wrong word. We have a sense of it, that it becomes an entirely authentic semblance of the thinking activity itself, as she says on page 47. There is no thinking ego. There is no worldless ego without also having a world of appearances. I cannot perceive reality and think myself without also being in a world and thinking through metaphors like bridges and egos and selves that I take from the world. And at the same point, and at the same time, however, when I do think, I desense the world. I evacuate myself to some extent from the beastliness of the multitude and the beastliness of the plurality, and I enter into this oneness. And it has, she says, no natural connection to reality on page 52. You leave reality, and yet you cannot destroy reality through thinking. You can suspend reality through thinking, but you can't destroy it. So that's what she says on page 53, that you can, that there's a way that the thinking ego can destroy the feeling of reality, cannot destroy the feeling of reality, but it can suspend it. And yet philosophers, while they may suspend reality in order to think, always come back to it. And it's a temporary suspension, and thus it's not dangerous. I think what she has in mind here is the dangerous destruction of reality, which she argues happens in something like totalitarianism, where a coherent fiction seeks to destroy reality and replace it with the fictional totalitarian ideology. And that's dangerous, because then reality is actually destroyed. She doesn't think thinking can destroy it. She thinks it can simply suspend it. This brings us to the final section of this chapter, section 8, called Science and Common Sense. And here she is comparing science to thinking. If thinking has to exit common sense, but it can never destroy it, but it must suspend it. If thinking is worldless and somewhat solipsistic, although never fully solipsistic, if thinking tries to reject reality, to free ourselves from reality so that we can think freely, but always is tied to reality, science has a different relation to common sense. Science, Arendt wants to argue, is bound up much more strongly with common sense than thinking is. For science to know is to know something truthfully, to uncover something hidden, and thus it's to save reality. Science is about correcting reality and bettering reality, but it's always tied to reality. So on 54, she says, for science, to know is an enormously refined prolongation of common sense reasoning, in which sense illusions are constantly dissipated, just as errors in science are corrected. So what science does is seeks to know reality, know the common world, the common sense world, better than common sense does. And it believes in progress, in this idea of better and better knowing, truer and truer knowing, a kind of boundlessness of progress. And yet, and this comes to the question of pseudoscience we talked a little bit about last week. If you're a good scientist, you know that you can never get to truth. You can never finalize the world because every level of scientific knowledge is simply another provisional knowledge that can be undone by better and newer sciences. There may be some sciences which can get very close to kind of truth knowledge, but not science in general. This changes the nature of truth, science does, so that truth is understood as a string of verities, a string of correct propositions, each one claiming general validity, even if we know that they're provisional. This is on page 55. And so truth, in this sense, is connected to correctness because the scientist remains bound to the common sense world. And this is where she writes this on pages 56 to 57. I think this is something that's confuses a lot of people. Even a technologist, which she often calls plumbers in her work. They're people who use science in order to make things that are useful in the world. So they're plumbers. Technologists are tied to the sensible world because they're actually trying to fix problems in the world. But what about people who do basic science, or basic research, or even mathematicians? She argues that the scientist, just like the technologist, remains bound to the common sense world. They're constrained by the common sense world because even the abstract basic scientist is still working within a world of factual truths. Even if they're working with sign language or mathematical symbols, which have no seemingly bearing in the world, they're actually trying to understand the world. And in trying to understand the world, they may translate it into mathematical symbols or languages, but they are constrained by the world, which is what underlies what they're interested in. All of this kind of scientific connection with common sense, with the common sense world, with the sensible world, with the apparent world, is not what thinking is, which is not sensible and does not concern itself with truth, but with meaning. So on page 61, she'll say, to expect truth to come from thinking signifies that we mistake the need to think with the urge to know. We have an urge to know, but knowing is tied to the common world. It's tied to the apparent world. We want to know about the world. Thinking, she thinks, is free from that. Thinking and meaning poses unanswerable questions. And it may lead to science insofar as if meaning poses unanswerable questions, it may lead to scientific people asking questions that they try and understand. On the other side, science may find that there's questions it can't answer, and it leaves room for those unanswerable questions, which may be addressed through prayer, faith, or thinking. In any case, thinking itself is about the pursuit of meaning, not the quest for knowledge, or the quest for meaning, not the desire for knowledge. And that's how she here distinguishes science from thinking in this section. There's a fair bit also about Kant and her arguing that Kant saw this sort of, but didn't fully understand it, and that our job in reading Kant is to understand him better than he understood himself, which is what he said about Plato. And so she makes a reading of Kant arguing that Kant, in his distinction between reason and knowledge, Verstand and Vernunft and Verstand, also sees this distinction between meaning and truth, or thinking and truth, even though he didn't fully understand it. Okay, I'm going to stop there, and I'm sorry, I didn't have anyone else letting people in. I'm sorry, I'm just letting some people in. I just finished the introduction. But I'll stop there for now. We have about an hour left. I'm gonna have to leave at 2:30 today. But I look forward to discussion. I see that some people have already raised your hands. Just a reminder, if you want to raise your hand, go down to the reaction button and hit raise hand. And you can also engage in a chat on the chat function. Please do be respectful, and we will continue on. The first question is Greg Feldman.
Oh, hi, Roger. Can you hear me okay?
I do hear you, Greg.
Okay, thanks. I'm having a little trouble understanding in that section or chapter or section 6 with Kant and the thinking ego. What exactly is she taking and leaving from Kant? And as part of sort of a deeper question is I don't quite grasp why chapters or sections 5 and 6 are kind of necessary and how this argument about thinking is unfolding. I know you went into this, but I just need some more clarification there.
Thanks, Greg. Okay. So those are two questions. The question about Kant in section 6 is simply that Kant, and I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but let's see if we can do it. Kant has an idea of what he calls the Ding an sich, right? The thing in itself. And so he makes a distinction between, there's a book. I'm sorry, I know I'm blurred. Okay. There's a book, and that's what we see. I see it and you see it. And because we both see it and we both recognize that we see it, and we both understand that if we lift it up, it goes up, and if we put it down, we go down. We sort of understand causality, and we understand certain laws of thinking, and so we can deal with the book as an object of experience, he calls it, or an object of intuition, or an object of experience. But he says there must also be the book that is the book. That's not just what I see or you see, or what John sees or Dina sees or anyone, but is the book, the thing itself. But we can never see that. And Kant goes, is trying to argue about to what extent this Ding an sich is ever accessible to us as human thinkers. In the same way, he says there's ourselves that we see and touch and hear, and then there's the ego, the thinking ego that is sort of underlies that, right? And again, we can never see it. Nothing of myself is given for thought, right? I'm a thing, he says. I am the thing itself. This is on page 42 in the Arendt. She says, it was the fact that in the consciousness of myself, in the sheer thinking activity, I am the thing itself, das Wesen selbst, das Ding an sich, the thing itself, the essence in itself. Although nothing of myself is thereby given for thought. Nothing is given in the sense of seeable. And so what she says is that Kant is not the only one, but he's one of the philosophers who more explicitly than anybody else is obsessed with thinking about this thing called the thinking ego that doesn't exist in the world, in the world of intuitions that you never see, and yet he thinks is. He still thinks it's meaningful. And so when the title of this is The Thinking Ego and the Self, Kant is the person who makes this distinction between the thinking ego and the self that is in the world, in the apparent world. and argues that they both are meaningful. And that's an example of what she calls an authentic semblance, right? I think it's just that Kant offers one of the great efforts to think this problem of how do we think about the thinking self that never appears, that we never see, that we never encounter in the world. So he names the problem, and to some degree he names a solution, although, as I just said, she's going to argue that he doesn't fully understand the solution he named, right? He makes this distinction between Vernunft and Verstand, and that she's going to talk about in section 8. And on the one hand, he wants to say that they're different. On the other hand, he's going to connect them both to intuitions, and specifically the intuition of time, which he thinks is a transcendental intuition. And if we were going to teach a course on Kant, we would go into that, but we'll leave it for that. Is that all right on the first question, Greg, or not?
No, it is. Thank you very much. Yeah.
On your second question of why these sections matter, I tried to say a little bit about it, but basically, Arendt is trying to start and be very clear that there's a problem. If you want to talk about thinking, we have a problem. We never see it. We never know it. How do you know what thinking is? How do you study thinking? Because, if you're a scientist, how do you study something that you can't see? And it's not that you just can't see with your eyes. You can't see with a microscope. You can't see with a neutron microscope. I mean, like electrons we don't see, but scientists can see them with technology. There's no amount of technology you're ever going to get that's going to let you see thinking, despite what some people in Silicon Valley think, that you can create, a brain. Yeah, you may be able to create a brain that does something, but will you ever be able to see thinking? Okay, I don't know 100%, but Arendt thinks generally no. And so in chapter 5 on appearance and semblance, she wants to say that even though we know that thinking is a semblance, that the thinking ego is, chapter 5 is more just general. There are authentic semblances, like the sun rising and setting. Chapter 6 is saying there's a particular semblance which people talk about, namely mostly philosophers like Kant, called the thinking ego, which we know doesn't exist. It's not real. And yet it's an authentic semblance, and therefore it's meaningful, and therefore worth talking about. That's why these two sections are in this chapter. Is that okay?
Yeah, no, that's great. So the thinking self is a kind of authentic semblance then for Arendt.
Exactly.
Okay. All right. No, that links it together for me then. Thank you.
Yep. John Stern, you're up next.
I have two questions. One is on this particular subject of thinking. If thinking occurs in the brain, why cannot the measuring of the activity of the brain at some point be considered thinking?
Yeah.
That's number one. The second is, I'm struggling with what is common sense?
Mm-hmm. Okay. So first of all, thinking doesn't take place in the brain. Just looking for the pages where she discusses this. Why am I not finding it?
Page 52. Top.
Yeah, I think that's right.
Also 49 and 50.
Right. So thinking simply doesn't take place in the brain because the brain for her is where we uh, pursue truth and knowledge. Um, the brain, is where science will take place, and insofar as it does, is it operates according to laws of causality and laws of reasoning and rationality and logic that are shared intersubjectivity and thus are tied to the sensible world. On the other hand, thinking is free from that and can take place. I mean, when she does want to say it, what she says is the thinking takes place in the mind, not the brain. She's here making a distinction between the brain as sort of the logical, calculating, reckoning part of human anatomy, and the mind as something like the pursuit of meaning. I know she talks about it in this chapter, and I know you guys have pointed me to it. I'm just not finding the passages I want.
But she does say is not thought processes thinking? Because she says very definitively on 52, which I noted, thought processes, unlike common sense, can be physically located in the brain. Is not thought processes the equivalent of thinking?
Okay.
And if indeed it is, and it does occur in the brain, then the capacity or the technology to measure the activity of the brain then means it's observable. Maybe we haven't discovered yet, but the technology is probably out on the frontier, or maybe it exists already, that it does occur there.
Yes, so, I think you're misreading that, John. And I mean, just in the sense that when she says thought processes, unlike common sense, can be physically located in the brain. I think what she simply means by that is, I mean, I don't know, can be physically located in the brain, but nevertheless transcend all biological data. So what I'll say is, what does she mean by physically located in the brain, but not be biological? I'm not entirely sure, what she has in mind. But what she doesn't mean is that that thinking is done is a brain-like activity. What she's, I mean, okay, maybe we then have to say the brain includes both the brain and the mind here. Again, common sense, on the contrary, and the feeling of realness belong to our biological apparatus. And the common sense reasoning, which the Oxford School of Philosophy mistakes for thinking, could certainly bear the same relation to reality that biological evolution does to environment. So what I guess I can say, at least in this paragraph, is what she'll say is thinking is not biological, and common sense is biological. Whether the brain, and I think what she maybe is playing with here is that the brain can have both a biological and a non-biological part. I'm not entirely sure. This is not how she usually formulates it in her writing. She usually makes a distinction between brain and mind. I think that's what she's here referring to. Yeah, I think it's a mistake to read that as saying that thinking is in the sort of gray matter of the brain.
Well, does that mean one thinks outside of themselves? How does one do that?
I don't have an answer to that, but we can. That's the mind, or the non-biological part of the brain. That's what people like Kant are referring to, and Plato are referring to, and Descartes are referring to when they talk about the self outside the body. right? When Descartes says that there's mind, there's pure mind, and there's pure body, and they never meet, that's solipsism. And Arendt thinks that's crazy. It's too far. But she understands where it comes from. It comes from the experience of thinking. And the thinker in the experience of thinking experiences themselves outside of the body, outside of not only the body, but outside of the world, outside of the apparent world. They experience themselves in the one, in the sun, in the world of ideas, in a world completely, and you know, this is something that all of us have the capacity to do from Arendt's point of view. All of us probably do it here and there in dreams or something, but very few of us ever actually do it a lot, and those are called philosophers. I mean, she describes this, I think, in a beautiful way, where she's talking about Kant's non-critical writings. On where does she do that? Sorry, for whatever reason, my page memory is failing me today. But when she talks about Kant's precritical writings, she gives a great description of what she has in mind by the thinking ego and dreams. Yeah, I think it's on page 44. Yeah, 43 to 44, where Kant says, or what she writes on 43 at the bottom, in the dreams and spiritual seers or mind seers, or yeah, I don't know, which is interpreted through dreams and metaphysics. Kant stresses the immateriality of the intelligible world, the world in which the thinking ego moves, in contrast to the inertia and constancy of dead matter that surrounds living beings in the world of appearances. In this context, he distinguishes between the notion the soul of man has of itself as Geist or mind through an immaterial intuition, and the consciousness through which it presents itself as a man by means of an image having its source in the sensation of physical organs. So this is Kant's telling and describing the difference between the mind and body, mind and sort of image. It is therefore, she writes, continuing, indeed always the same subject, both the mind and the body, that is both a member of the visible and invisible world, but not the same person, since what I as a mind think is not remembered by me as a man, and conversely, my actual state as a man does not enter into my notion of myself as mind. This is Kant. And she continues, and Kant speaks in a strange footnote of a, quote, certain double personality which belongs to the soul even in this life. He compares the state of the thinking ego to the state of sound sleep, quote, when the external senses are completely at rest. The ideas in sleep, he suspects, quote, may be clearer and broader than the very clearest in the waking state, precisely because man at such times is not sensible of his body. These are experiences of the thinker, of the thinking ego. And Arendt thinks these things, this is what she's calling, this is what the question I asked her before from Greg, these are the authentic semblances. They're not real. They're not real in the sense of apparent. They're not worldly. And yet they are experiences that one has, and they are what she calls authentic semblances. You asked a second question, which I've now forgotten, John.
What is common sense?
What is common sense? Common sense is, it is the sixth sense, is one way to put it, which unites the other five senses and fits them into the world. That's one way of putting it. Another way of putting it is common sense is the intersubjectivity of the world that is what allows the fact that we all have, what is it? Sight, smell, sound, touch, and taste. And I taste, see, smell, hear, whatever things. And you do too, John. And Dina does too. And somehow we all know we're talking about the same objects. And so common sense is what gives us the common sense to know that we're talking about the same things.
Well, most mammals have the five senses. Are we the only species then, at least at this point, that has a sixth sense?
No, I don't think so. I mean, she doesn't think, she says any she talks about the language of species. I mean, there's a lot of species that, I mean, have common sense. I mean, if you have a dog and you take your dog, dogs recognize each other, right? That's a common sense. So I don't think there's any limitation of common sense to humans. What we add to common sense as humans, which it's debatable that other species can add, is on the one hand science and logicality and rationality. Although, I mean, some species certainly have some of that. And on the other hand, thinking, as she understands it.
Professor Roger,
Yeah.
may I just jump in to add something little, very short?
Okay.
Just to say that for Hannah Arendt, or to remind that for Hannah Arendt, actually the common sense is the most important, I would say, relevant sense for the political action. Yeah, for the political action, Professor Roger. Thank you.
I mean, common sense, is important for. It's important for our end. It's important. You need common sense in order to have a common world. I mean, politics, in many ways, for our end, as I understand it, is driven by a critique of common sense. We get involved in politics both to reaffirm common sense, but also in most situations because we find common sense conservative or lacking and needs to be changed. And so there's an aspect of freedom in politics, which is that both has to recognize common sense, but also can begin the process of reforming it. And that is an important part of politics.
Definitely, Professor Roger. Thank you.
Yeah. Dina, you're up next.
I hope my question will make sense. So she defines progress in terms of the accumulation of knowledge on page 55, sort of the exercise of modern science being one of, ever expanding knowledge. But is there a sense of progress in the area of meaning, in the context of thinking, where we are engaged in what it means for us, for something to be, as opposed to asking ourselves whether it is true or whether it exists? And if the answer to that question is no, there's no sense of progress in the realm of meaning, of thinking, then what does that tell us about her concept of the relationship between thinking and good and evil?
Okay. Thanks, Dina.
In other words, to rephrase the question based on the previous question, if politics is a politics of critique, is politics more in the part of Verstand or more in the part of Vernunft, or is it a combination of both?
Wow. Okay. I mean, okay, I think politics has to be a combination of both, but let me get there. The progress question is a good one. It is, she doesn't, she talks a lot about progress in many of her writings, and almost always in a critical way, right? She's critical of progress. I've written a little bit about this at times, but I have to admit it's one of the parts of her work that I always have to try and refigure out. But here's what I think I understand about it, which I'm happy to talk about because I'm not sure this is something I understand as well as other things. Progress, I think, is an authentic semblance. It's clearly, I mean, first of all, you never see progress. Progress is not something you see, right? I mean, it's an idea. And it's an idea that is obviously wrong. You know, we say things progress and get better and better, but if they always were going to progress and they were going to get better and better, how can they, either they're going to, are they ever going to get, do we know that, how do we know they're better and not worse? And B, you know, do we ever get to the best? Science seems to have this idea of unlimited progress, and yet there's no end point to it. And if there were an end point to it, at one point she says we'd have to ignore it because we still have to get better and better. And so but she thinks nevertheless it's a semblance that we believe in, we take seriously, that has meaning in our world. So the first answer to your question, I think it is meaningful. I think what's interesting though is Arendt thinks it's meaningful in a dangerous way. In that it is in that progress contains within itself a lack of limits. Which, you know, as in the sense you just quoted on 55, the point is that the modern idea of progress implicitly denies such limitations. And then the idea that there's no limits to progress, the authentic semblance of progress drives us to constantly create new things, to constantly innovate, to constantly grow. And this idea of constant growth is at odds with the human need for a home, the human need for a common world, the human need for a space in which we feel comfortable or you know, together with other people. So in the origins of totalitarianism, she'll talk about how imperialism follows an economic logic of infinite growth, which is at odds with politics, because politics has to have a limited community and there have to be you know, legal and ethical rules and norms. And if we expand to a world community and keep getting, and then to a universal community and keep getting bigger and bigger, we lose the political ethos that holds us together as a polity, and we weaken politics and we elevate instead laws of infinite growth or economics. And I think she has a similar critique of science, insofar as, again, she's not anti-science at all, but she thinks that science, which pursues truth in an infinite process without actually pursuing meaning, loses meaning in its quest for ever constantly undoing deception and finding a new truth and a new truth and a new truth. And so, yeah, I think progress is something that is meaningful, but for her, it's meaningful in that it actually challenges meaningfulness, and in doing so, threatens to replace meaning with progress, or with, progressive truths. And I think if I'm right about that, I think that will answer your question about politics as well. Is that
Yes.
clear, Tina?
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Rob.
Thanks, Roger. I just want to clarify the concept of reality. On page, on page 50, she writes, the reality of what I perceive is guaranteed by its worldly context, which includes others who perceive as I do on the one hand, and by the working together of my five senses on the other. And what I'm thinking is that, well, what does it mean for something to be working together with my five senses of the other? Well, if you look back on this page,
Just so you know, that, I mean, just to go to John's question, the working together of my five senses on the other, that's what Thomas Aquinas calls common sense, and that's how she's using
Right.
common sense. Okay, just point that out.
So it's like, what is required of an object to be grasped by this common sense? So if you look at 45, she says in the first sentence of chapter 7, reality in a world of appearances is first of all characterized by standing still and remaining the same long enough to become an object of acknowledgement and recognition by the subject. So she seems to be saying that the object needs to persist or endure in a certain way so that it can be acknowledged through the senses or through the common sense. But what does it mean for something to be standing still and remaining? This is something that I don't think she says much about. The only really kind of idea that I could really find was back on page 40, where she says, in inner experience, the only thing to hold on to distinguish something at least resembling reality from the incessantly passing moods of our psyche is persistent repetition. So I guess to bundle this all together, I'm curious about her understanding of repetition. Is it an object of standing still due to its repetition? Also, to go back to the idea of Kant and his dreaming, when we're dreaming, the senses no longer are sensing objects, so that repetition falls away, but what is repeated is kind of the dream itself. So it is a reality in a sense that Kant is talking about, but not the reality when we are awake in the world. Any ideas about that concerning reality would be helpful.
Yeah. I mean, your turn back to chapter 5 is interesting. I'm gonna have to look at that or think about that. So I'm not sure that's the same thing, but I don't know. But in chapter 7, yeah, I mean, I think you've articulated it pretty well. I guess I'm a little bit unclear why you're having a problem with it. I mean, so reality is what we can see, taste, smell, touch, and hear, and others can as well. Which means it has to last enough that people see it. It has to be standing enough that people see it. What's unclear? What's the problem with that? Maybe because I'm not sure I understand why you're confused by it, or not confused, why you're questioning it.
Yeah, I guess she doesn't really elucidate the point of standing still and remaining. I mean, I guess if we're speaking obviously, like
she's quoting,
yes.
She's quoting there. I assume it's Husserl, but I don't know.
Okay. What does it mean for something to persist through time? And this is a very general question, but it sounds like there's some, if repetition is resembling reality, it sounds like the repetitious of the sense perceptions is what constitutes the existence of the object as something to be encountered by the common sense. But she doesn't say anything about this. She just says standing still and remaining.
So in the section on page 40 that you turn to, she's arguing that Kant's discussion of time is based metaphorically upon spatiality, And it is precisely the absence of form and hence of any possibility of intuition that characterizes our experience of inner sensations. So things that are not without form, and another way of putting that is without standing and preserving, or whatever the words were, standing and remaining, that don't have any form, can't be intuited. And those are the things that are sort of these inner things, these semblances, which we can't see. In inner experience, the only thing to hold on to, another hold on to, standing, remaining, to distinguish something at least resembling reality from the incessantly passing moods of our psyche, is persistent repetition. So in the inner experience, it's the fact that I repeatedly experience fear, or I repeatedly experience thinking, that is in a sense serves for inner experiences what standing and remaining do for outer experiences, and gives them a certain reality that makes them authentic semblances, even though they can't be seen. In extreme cases, repetition can become so persistent that it results in the unbroken permanence of one mood, one sensation. But this invariably indicates a grave disorder of the psyche, the euphoria of the maniac, or the depression of the melancholic.
Why don't you invoke Nietzsche? And I'm thinking of the law of eternal return here.
Because this is psychology here, not.
I don't know. I don't know why I would. I mean, this is not about an affirmation of being. I don't know, Vivian. Why would I?
Because somehow there's a relation. Somehow I'm sensing, but I don't know.
No, I mean, this is repetition. This is not the eternal recurrence of the same. This is not an affirmation of my will on the world, which is what Nietzsche is talking about in the eternal recurrence of the same. I think this is different.
It came up in the chat before about William James, and I think this is the spot where she's kind of close to him. The blooming, buzzing confusion. So the only thing in those rough seas that we can really latch onto is when something occurs over and over again. But that something is a phenomenon, and then we endow upon it the name reality because we begin to rely on it.
I agree with Jeff. Totally, William James. Not totally, but very close to William James.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I mean, you very well read. I don't know if Arendt ever read William James. I don't remember her citing him. Obviously, she's here relying a lot on Merleau-Ponty. A lot of this comes out of her reading of Ponty.
If she hasn't read William James, sorry to interrupt, a lot of the things she's saying sounds like stream of consciousness. It sounds very Jamesian.
I don't think it's stream of consciousness. I mean, but in fact, in the section I read about Kant earlier, that she quotes, she wants to say as an articulation of dreams, it's sort of wrong, but I don't know. I don't know enough about James to add to that. And I'm not sure what adds to it to say that it's Jamesian or such. What she wants to say is that that this inner experience that one has, which is an attempt to account for inner experiences that are not sensible and that are outside of the world. There are many of them, right? She talks about fear, she talks about lust, and she talks about the fact that we have the conscious decision to choose to turn lust into love or fear into courage. And maybe all that is on one side, and maybe there is a Jamesian connection there. Her interest here is in a particular experience, which is the swiftness of thought and the thinking ego. I don't know how much James says about that because I just don't know. But he may, and if he does, that's great. But that's what she's interested in here because she's trying to write about thinking. How? What's next? Are you here, Hal? Stephen, you're next.
I have a concern, maybe 2 or 3 related small questions, and that is, why did she choose the mundane, quotidian English word thinking for what she's talking about? Because, I mean, the casual use was which native English speakers talk about thinking or a thought, leads to a lot of confusion. It seems to me there were terms like reflection or speculation, perhaps even contemplation, which raises the question, how is her idea of thinking different from contemplation? That really confuses me because of what she says at the beginning of the book, and that is, she certainly implies that Adolf Eichmann would not have been at least as complicit in the Holocaust if he had thought. But did she ever think, there you go, that he would think, Eichmann would think at the depth that she is talking about? And then she has this epigram at the beginning by Heidegger saying, thinking doesn't bring us knowledge, doesn't bring us wisdom, doesn't solve the riddles of the universe, and does not endow us directly with the power to act. So she's trying to cram so much into this that it ends up being confusing and where she's actually going to. The difference between meaning and knowledge, I get, but why she chose this word and to my mind created this confusion.
Thanks. Well, Hannah Arendt, at this point in her life, thinks in 2 languages, right? She thinks in English and German primarily, and maybe a little Greek. And there's no doubt that in thinking about thinking, she's influenced by a number of people, including Heidegger, right? And Heidegger uses the word thinking, denken, and he he uses it for a number of reasons. It doesn't have a Latinate root or a Greek root, so it's in Heidegger's, it's not corrupted by those for Heidegger. It's plain and simple, and it's also in his reading connected to dichten, to poetry, to saying things that are meaningful. And it's in his work distinguished from science? I mean, Arendt is not fully citing all this, but in the chapter on distinguishing thinking from science, it's clearly indebted to Heidegger. So why does Arendt use the word thinking? I think she tells us at the beginning of the book, as you said, that there were two sort of reasons. One was her just being struck by the thoughtlessness of Eichmann. And the second was her desire to move to sort of, after showing how there's been a reversal of contemplation and action in the Vita Activa, the need to think about how some kinds of thinking are active. So, why she doesn't use other words, I could, on the one hand, I think denken and thinking are words that have resonances for her. Denken, dichten. I think it's a very powerful word in German and English. Contemplation has sort of a sense of almost lack of activity, right? That's how it was distinguished from Vita Activa. And the whole premise of this book is to make thinking active. And so contemplation would not be a good word for her. That was one word you suggested. I forget, what were some other words you threw out?
I threw out reflection and speculation.
Right. So reflection, again, I think, seems reflective and not active.
But how is thinking active for her? She's talking about withdrawing from the world. I mean, in one hand, to me, thinking is very practical from the ground up. But I mean, she's saying it's active and inactive. And I understand that we can get lost in thought and that we withdraw to think if we are thinking deeply.
Yeah.
And sometimes we think very shallowly. Again, I don't have any problem with that, but she doesn't seem to be making these distinctions, and she still hasn't convinced me how thinking would have made a dam for Adolf Eichmann and what he did. Because I never see him going there, not the way she is describing it.
Yeah.
Or most people.
Yeah. I mean, we haven't, we've only read now the first of 4 chapters. I'm not sure she'll, and by the way, all she says in the chapter about Eichmann is she asks herself the question, could thinking have done this? She doesn't answer it and say it would. I think it's incredibly questionable as a proposition. And I think she doesn't ever answer it in her work. And she simply says it's a question. In the next chapter on mental activities, we'll talk a little bit more about the activities of thinking. And then really in the last chapter of thinking on where are we when we think, if there's an answer to your question about Eichmann, that's where you're going to get it. What she wants to at least offer as a potential argument is that thinking, by freeing ourselves from the world of appearances and freeing ourselves from truths, allows us to, in a sense, step back and stop and think out from a position where we, ask, should we be doing this? And free ourselves from kind of movements and conformities and the sort of general rush of life in a critical way. Again, not entirely clear that this is something that is workable. I think that's at least the idea she's pushing. I don't have a, I've told you why I don't think contemplation or reflection work. I think thinking is a powerful word. To some degree, it's only powerful if you make it powerful in the way you are talk about it, and you have to decide whether you think she makes it powerful.
Well, I mean, I'm rooting for her in the sense that you've been talking about, but I'm frustrated when if she would make the distinction between shallow thinking and deep thinking or reflective thinking. I mean, it seems to me there's many permutations that we can talk about, from, the simplest mental activities to the most complex, the most visionary. I mean, that's why I think we get lost in this term, because even as we discuss it, you say I think, or I say I think, and it seems like the way she's talking about it in this book, it's like, well, you're not thinking the way I mean thinking to be, and that it frustrates me that she's not making a sounded argument, as I think she has implicit in what she's saying.
Yeah, I mean, like Arendt doesn't make those kind of arguments, right? She sort of, that's the way she writes. But yeah, I mean, this is also, as she says, this is her first ever attempt, as she puts it, to do philosophy. And one has to ask whether you like her doing philosophy or not. There was a long time, I'll just be honest, there was a long time I resisted this book because I thought it was her doing philosophy in a way that was not as compelling as some of her other books, where I think she thinks about the world. I've warmed to this first part on thinking. A number of you have asked to read The Willing, which is why we're reading it again, which I had resisted because I still find that part her most philosophical, and I've never found it truly compelling. But I haven't read it probably in 20 years, I'll be honest. So I'm looking forward to doing so and seeing what I can make of it with you when we get to the Willing section. But we'll see. Whether, we'll see. Ted, you got to unmute yourself, Ted. Ted?
Yeah, I'm going to be really quick. I'm totally confused now. I thought thinking was an inner speech and was more consciousness than levels of thinking. And everybody thinks to some degree. So now I'm totally confused what she means by thinking. And my next point is, I think this is I may be wrong, but I'm trying to speak quickly so other people could get in. I'm kind of wondering, Arendt is a phenomenologist. And I think this book is a stretch for her, because she's going away from what her strength is, and her strength is analyzing phenomena, and brain and thinking is not that. So I think this is very much of a stretch for her to write. And I wonder why she wrote the book.
Well, I think she's trying to think about thinking as a phenomena and the life of the mind as a phenomena. And the problem is, and that's why she starts the way she does, is here I am, I'm a phenomenologist, if you want to use those words. And I want to write about thinking and the life of the mind as a phenomena. And the problem is you can't see it. It's invisible. And so I start with that problem, right? That's how you start. And I think she's struggling with it. And as we've found, what she says is, okay, even though it's not a phenomena in the sense of visible or part of the worldly context of sensible things, it is a kind of semblance that's not simply a mirage, not simply something that can be corrected. Thinking actually is a phenomenon of the world. It's just not visible, and it can never be seen, and we can never analyze it that way. And so we have to take it seriously as as a non-visible, non-sensible, non-empirical phenomena. That's what I think chapter 1 is about. That's she's laying the ground of how do you approach thinking as a phenomenologist. Is that helpful? Yeah. I mean, on the question of talking with oneself, the 2 and 1, she'll talk about that in section 17, the answer of Socrates, and then section 18, the 2 and 1. And we'll come back to that, Ted. I don't think that's in any way inconsistent with what she's laid out so far. I think that's where she's headed. So we'll do that. Vivian.
Hi. So please excuse me, but it is very difficult, and I am not a structured thinker. However, I may not be a structured thinker, but I have to tell you, I don't feel confused. Hannah Arendt has given us this book because these are the last writings, the last thoughts of a very great thinker about thinking. Now, there's just so much to this. And on the way to returning to this point, I just want to say when science was mentioned earlier, pursuing truth without seeking meaning or whatever. And this is a question you could perhaps answer at the end. Does this then mean, without seeking meaning, I'm thinking that implies without that meaning, we are then unable to invoke judgment. So then we would be lacking judgment, and judgment's a big part of this book. But anyway, to return to understanding what Hannah Arendt means with the term thinking. For Arendt, thinking is always, we know, the space for, it's always critical thinking. And for her, it was not an option. It was the very substance of life, bigger than even a sort of haptic phenomenological perception of the world. It was everything. There is no living or existing in the world without thinking. And please interrupt and correct me if you think I'm wrong before I continue.
I think I generally agree with that. I mean,
and I'm not finished, so yeah.
Okay, let's try and be quick because I only have about
okay. Well, just that
minutes left,
because just to say that to try to understand this idea of authentic semblance, for me personally, I can't even begin to have, let's say, the tools of analysis here to understand this without thinking about Merleau-Ponty and phenomenology and sort of haptic perception, the way in which, and he often wrote and thought about artists in this regard. And this is not a value judgment or a virtue, but I am saying that I think it's only artists, all kinds of artists, who make concrete what it is that we see. Anyone outside of artists making concrete what we see are people making inauthentic claims in terms of various inauthentic constructions. So that in thinking about phenomenology, he would, you would then go to how somebody like Giacometti explained why his a semblance of human forms or human how he came to that shape of something, or you would think of Merleau-Ponty saying that the artist brings his body with him. So when we think of those of the concretization of seeing, then we can begin to understand about authentic semblance and the differences, the distinctions that she makes, and between physical or metaphysical and these difficult things. So that's what I wanted to say.
Thank you. I mean, I think the question of how you actualize thinking is a good one, and I think one of the main ways she imagines that is through art, as she talks about in the sections of the human condition on art. Another would be action. So it wouldn't just be art for her, but art is certainly one of the ways in which thinking is made manifest in the world. And I think that's an important point. So there's a bunch of questions still, and I have really only time for one more. Is there, Anthony, you're next.
Well, no, very briefly. So it just seems to me that Arendt raises the Kantian distinction between phenomenal and noumenal, and then ultimately says, well, since we only, since our thinking can only reference what we sense, like the noumenal category is sort of rejected ultimately. And so my question is, isn't the object of thought for most of us to get to the things themselves? Isn't that? So I would see the noumenal as sort of aspirational.
Yeah, that's the, I understand your point.
Thinking, but rather than to completely reject the term, I don't know.
I understand your point. I mean, that's what I think a lot of people say, and I think that's very much the spirit in which Kant presents it. Arendt is not, is arguing something else, right? She wants to argue that insofar as we think of thinking as an aspiration to reach the noumenal, the thing in itself, our thinking is still caught up in the common sense world and the world of semblances and the world of appearances, and that's not unimportant. It's important. It's science, but it's caught up in this idea of truth as verity, of correctness, and it disallows an important phenomenal experience, an important experience that's not seen, but that we can find in our inner experience of the activity of thinking. And that's also an important human experience that is ignored, that is not aimed at finding the truth of the world, but is actually aimed at things like prayer or poetry, or a kind of meaningfulness that has no claim to making a claim about the noumenal or the scientific or the truth of the world.
Thank you, Roger. Thank you.
Thanks, Anthony.
Thank you.
I see that there's a bunch of other questions, and I apologize. I do have to go because I'm barely going to make my plane. But I will. I will join you again on. I think we're meeting next on September 3rd. I apologize for this confusion that some people thought we weren't meeting this week because of what I made a mistake about saying last week. But now we're not meeting until September 3rd. We have the 2 weeks of August off, and we'll continue with chapter 2 of Life of the Mind then. Have a great rest of August and enjoy reading Hannah Arendt, and I'll see you guys soon.